For those of you who don't know me, but I think everybody here knows me, I'm Lorie, and I'm the worship pastor here at Rise. And I'm on the E-team, which is the executive board. And anyway, that's who I am. I want to thank you guys for letting me share. And I especially want to thank Pastor Ben for, number one, we're going through the book of Mark, and he just so happened to give me one of my favorite verses in the book of Mark. But what this is about today is identity, our identity, and the power of God's love. And I have to say that when I met Pastor Ben, I had lost my identity. I'd forgotten who I was. And I was just kind of going through life. Do you ever do that? You just go through life. You've got your schedule. You got to do this, this, and this. But you forget who you are. Does anybody ever go through that? And God used Pastor Ben to call that back out of me. And so I'm so grateful to him. So I'm going to try to cut some of this. So bear with me. I hope I don't get mixed up in the middle somewhere. But I want to start off by telling you the story of three brothers. Okay, these guys lived around the turn of the century, 1900, 1910, up to maybe the 1950s. And there were these three brothers. And the oldest brother was Edward, and the middle brother was George, and the youngest brother was Johnny. And these guys, these men, they grew up under this society that had picked out who they would be as they grew up. And so instead of them getting to just be who they are, it was picked out that Edward, well, he was going to be this great leader. And George, well, their nanny abused George. And so George ended up with this horrible speech impediment, and he became very shy, very quiet, very withdrawn. And then Johnny was born with a mental handicap, and a little bit later he developed epilepsy. And back in those days, if there was somebody that was mentally handicapped, they didn't get to really be out in society. They were kind of just pushed away and hidden. And so the imposed, we call it an imposed identity, was placed upon these three brothers. And they grew up under that. And I'll tell you how that turns out in a minute. But we're going to start here by just reading the section of Scripture that Pastor Ben assigned for me to share on today. And if you want to put up that Mark. So, and a man with leprosy came to Jesus, imploring him and kneeling down and saying to him, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Moved with compassion, Jesus reached out with his hand and touched him and said to him, "I am willing, be cleansed." And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed. And he, Jesus, sternly warned him and immediately sent him away and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded, as a testimony to them." But he went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the news around to such an extent that Jesus could no longer publicly enter a city, but stayed out in unpopulated areas, and they were coming to him from everywhere. So here's this man with leprosy, and a companion verse to this verse is in Luke chapter 5, and it refers to this man as being full of leprosy. So he'd had it a while. Leprosy grows very, very slowly, and for him to be full of leprosy, it had to have been years that this man had been sick. I have a couple pictures if you want to. So that's a picture of someone with leprosy, and then go ahead and show the other one. And then what leprosy does to limbs is it attacks the nerves, and then it eventually attacks bone, and it's such a sad disease. Thankfully, it's easily treated now, but back then, no. And you've heard the term leper colony. Have you all heard that? Oh, they had leper colonies here in the United States up until the 1940s. Isn't it? And it's so strange to think that you would have thought by then, but no. So in Leviticus chapters 13 and 14, God outlines these instructions about what to do if somebody has leprosy. And I would read it, but I don't know if you've looked at Leviticus 13 and 14, but they're long. But just take my word for it. You can go back and check that out. But one of the first things they were to do is if somebody got close to them, they were to shout, "Unclean! Unclean!" And they had to make this proclamation over themselves if anybody came near. Unclean! Unclean! And imagine if we did that. If we made that proclamation over ourselves all the time, unclean, unclean, it would kind of mess with our minds, wouldn't it? And so here's a man who's had leprosy a lot of years, and he's been calling himself unclean whenever he gets around people. And talk about an imposed identity. What was he before he had leprosy? Was he a carpenter? Was he a fisherman? What did he do? Who was he? But now everybody knew him as unclean. So that was an imposed identity. Not only did they have to shout, "Unclean, unclean," but they had to live outside the city. And outside the city was like near the tombs. So that would be the equivalent of our graveyards. So not only are you sitting there shouting unclean, but you're living in a graveyard. They had to tear their clothes. They had to look ragged. They were not to brush their hair. They were to keep their hair really unkempt, really messy. They had to cover the bottom half of their faces. But, and two, this was during the time of Moses. And so that is when there was the tabernacle of Moses, and the presence of God was in that tabernacle. And there was also just a special presence of God in the city. But they couldn't, so because they had to be outside the city, even though God is with us always, they were outcasts. They couldn't really even be accepted by God. And not only that, but it was believed that a person that wasn't only physically sick with leprosy, but it was a sign that they were spiritually sick. So how would you like to be this guy? And talk about an identity crisis, and talk about being alone and outcast. A lot of years ago, I worked in the summers at a local nursing home. And I remember being in the break room with some of the staff. And as they would talk about the people that were in the nursing home as if they were nothing, as if they had no value whatsoever. And they were just a job. They were somebody they had to put up with. And I know I remember making it my purpose there to call out who they are, to remind them who they are. I would look over their care plans, that tells their history, and I would try to help them know you're not just something, you're valuable. And we do that in society, though, don't we? It's really a sad thing. I had a friend, her name was Lisa. Lisa is with the Lord now. But when she was growing up, her mother was a drug addict, and her dad was an alcoholic. And so her mom would put Lisa in her bedroom for days and days and days. And Lisa would have no contact with anybody. They might slide some food under the door or through the door, but she was really abused. Plus, she was physically abused as well as emotionally. And when she was in her early 20s, she developed what's called multiple personality disorder. And she ended up with all these personalities. And you honestly wouldn't know who you're talking to until you would get around her and you would realize, oh, she's the child right now. This is this little child, or this is the artist. So she would put on all these hats and all these personalities. Each one of those personalities were looking to be validated. Each one of those personalities, she was looking that somebody would recognize her and consider her valuable. I have to tell you that God healed Lisa dramatically. And not only did he heal her, but he used her. He used her with a lot of people that had mental illness. He used her. She wrote some of the most beautiful worship songs ever. And pretty neat. But we're taught in society to find our value or identity in what we do, right? Right? What about social media? Think about social media and how people are being assigned identities on social media. They're bullied on social media. Think about what kids learn in school. They're being told how to find their identity. See what I'm saying? And it's really gotten bad. It's really gotten bad. And I think God wants us to know who we are. You know, when my husband was fighting cancer, he was amazing as he walked through it. He was just amazing. But what happened to his body is he carried a lot of fluid in his stomach because he had pancreatic cancer. And so he had this big round belly. And then he had these really skinny, spindly legs, and he had skin tears all over his skin because his skin had become so fragile. And so he had spots all over him. And he and I were in Barnes and Noble, and of course he was, he would walk like it was just all he could do. But there was this group of teens, and they came and stood around him and began to mock him. And, he was a tough guy, and he never let things bug him, but that one got into his heart. And I remember him coming home, and he just kind of fell into the recliner. And for several days, that's where he stayed, and he just slept. He didn't pick up his Bible. I didn't see him praying like I normally saw him praying. And, we began, my sons and I and Natalie, to really pray for him because he had lost who he was. He forgot who he was. He began to believe what people said about him, and he forgot who he was. I remember him writing in his journal, and he said, "Do I have no value?" And then here's a quote from his journal, and he said, "One of the most troublesome areas for me is the loss of muscle and weight. Since July, I've lost 70 pounds. It's very disturbing when you look at yourself in the mirror and see a grotesque bag of bone, muscle, and spotted flesh staring back at you." So like Eric, that was my husband's name, Eric, and like my friend Lisa, the leprous man had imposed identities, an imposed identity on him. And I'm thinking he had to have forgotten who he was. And yet, I'm sure somewhere he heard about Jesus. And this man, when he came to Jesus, what guts it took. Because he's supposed to be outside the city, right? He's not, and he's supposed to be yelling, "Unclean, unclean." And yet, he comes barreling in there, and let's look at Mark 1:40. "And a man with leprosy came to Jesus, imploring him and kneeling down and saying to him, 'If you are willing, you can make me clean.'" Talk about aggressive faith. Talk about just going for it, risking everything. People could have just, they could, you know what they would do with lepers? Because they couldn't touch them, they would have like sticks, and they would beat them if they got too close. This guy's got guts coming to Jesus like he did. And the Bible tells us that in Mark 1:41 and 42, Jesus, moved with compassion, Jesus reached out with his hand and touched him and said to him, "I am willing, be cleansed." And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed. Now, if I had been Jesus that day, and I asked Cindy if I could do this, I probably would have done something like this. You know what I'm saying, right? I mean, this is leprosy, right? It would have been all I could do to even do that. Right. But because Jesus is who Jesus is, can't you see him doing this? Can't you see him really touching him? Yeah, I like that. Because that's who our God is. John Ortberg is an author I really like, and one of his books is Who is This Man? And he has a quote, "We are never told that Jesus had compassion on someone because they deserved it. It was only because they were in need." And there's not one of us that deserve, but we're sure as heck in need, right? Yeah. The thing that's so cool about Jesus was his compassion. And I'm not going to go into it because I'm trying to not go too long, but there's a lot of verses where the compassion of Jesus was alluded to or mentioned as he worked miracles. So just imagine, because Jesus lives in us, right? And imagine if we each walked in the love and the compassion that Jesus did. Holy cow. What would be happening in this world? I mean, wouldn't it be huge? It's love first, then power. Amen. That's the way it goes. And let's go on to Mark 1:43. Then Jesus, sternly warned him and immediately sent him away. And he said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a testimony to them." So, why did Jesus tell this man who's been cleansed already, right? This guy is free of leprosy. Why did he tell him to go to the priest and go through the ritual cleansing that's in Leviticus 13 and 14? And I'm telling you, that thing took days. I mean, what they went through, it took days. And he didn't need the ritual cleaning because Jesus had already taken care of that, right? It was to be a testimony to the priests who were Jesus' worst critics. You know, another thing that I thought was really interesting here, I think about my friend Lisa. Remember, she's the one who was locked in a room. And boy, it took her a long time to be able to get around people. And she would get so nervous when she was around people. Sometimes she would just stutter. And she really struggled with it. You know, she got help for it when she was in school. It took a long time because even after she came to Jesus, to be completely healed of that isolation that she endured. But nope, not this leprous guy. He gets healed. And even though Jesus told him to go to the priest first, he didn't do that. He ran out and he started telling everyone. And obviously, Jesus didn't heal just his body. Jesus healed his mind because he was able to go out and get around people. For how long had he not? And also, this man became an evangelist right away. Mark 1:45, Jesus could no longer publicly enter a city, but stayed out in unpopulated areas. Now think about that for a second. You know how Jesus takes on everything of ours. So here was a man who lived in unpopulated areas for a long time. But now Jesus, it has to go out to unpopulated areas because this guy went and told everybody. But isn't that just like Jesus? So what was this guy's imposed identity? Jesus took that on. It's just what Jesus does. Does that make sense? And the people were coming to him from everywhere. Mark 1:45. That love brought so many people to Jesus. So the three brothers I mentioned at the very first. So what the oldest brother, Edward, what happened to him is they were all part of the royal family. And Edward became king, and he became this leader, but it was never in his heart to be that. And he fell in love, and he abdicated from the throne. And then George takes over. And George, because he was so wounded and shy and scared, and he stuttered, and people could hardly stand to be around him because he could never get his words out. But George took over, and he was one of the best kings that the UK had ever known or ever seen. He became his identity. It wasn't the imposed identity that was put upon him as a child, which was weak, shy, can't say anything. But he became who he was. Edward became who he was. Johnny passed away at the age of 13. You know, my friend Lisa discovered who she was. And for those of you who knew her, she was a treasure. And Eric, my husband, who referred to himself as grotesque, he began to get his heart back, even in the midst of all that he was going through. And this is a quote from his journal. And he says, "Though God does not create disease or wish it on anyone, he can use traumatic situations to wake us up to what really matters. Entering the realm of the grotesque can free one into intimacy with God. Somehow, it cleanses the soul from extraneous matters. It removes all pretense of pride that usually gets in the way and uncovers what is really important, the part that God sees. In all its beauty, it's the heart." You know, when Eric walked through what he did, and Lisa, and how Eric began to think of himself as cancer. Instead of being Eric, he thought everybody looked at him. If you saw him on the street, you would immediately go, "Oh, that guy has cancer." And he began to feel like cancer. But God brought Eric back to who he was. And Eric began to be the man who he was and to walk in his heart again. Our relationship during that time, you know, it's funny how when you walk through things, you just take on these identities. And I took on the identity caregiver. And boy, I was going to be good at it. I was going to be the best caregiver ever. And just go, 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 go. Energizer bunny, you know? Go, 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 go. And he was sick. But what God did is reminded us who we were. Yeah, I was a caregiver to Eric, but I was his wife. And he, was sick, but he was my knight in shining armor. And, you know, it's God's gentle place of refuge where light transcends feelings of grotesqueness. It's that place where God lovingly encourages the person that has been misled into believing that he or she is completely unlovely, to open up and tell him all about it. Here, this heavy-laden soul empties it all out to him, leaving no stone unturned until everything was poured out, every last drop. In this place of open-faced intimacy with God, the light of God's love uncovers what is priceless. It's that shimmering diamond. It's the heart. It's the human spirit. It's not what's been imposed upon us, whether it's life circumstances or social media or peers. It's the heart. And that is so beautiful. And that is so valuable that Jesus went to the cross for it. I'd like to ask the prayer team, whoever's here, to come on forward. Do you need to come to Jesus today? Is there an area of your life where maybe you've forgotten who you are? You know, I never would want to force somebody to come up here. I hate that. Absolutely hate that. Would not do that. But if it's in your heart and you need that, I want to encourage you to do that. If you need physical healing today, I'd like to ask you to pray about coming forward. And worship team, do you mind coming on up? As a people, as Christian people, do we have an absolutely gigantic love for our neighbor? You know, I had to get so honest with God about this one because I'm busy, you know, and I think of all these things I need to get done. And what's crazy is this week, as I'm praying about this message, is my whole week, God said, what's more important? Sharing this message or the needs that people had and spending time with them and loving. And I'm just being honest here, but that's just me. I need a baptism of his love for not just the church, but it's the people outside these walls. I need his heart for them. I need Jesus to move through me like he did then. And so we need a baptism of his love. And so now we're going to be done. Like at the end here, this is a time where God speaks to, as well as during the service, but here. And so we're going to stay here. We're going to minister. We're going to sing. But if you're done and you feel like it's time to go, that's good. Just be free to do that and go. There's refreshments over there. Go grab some coffee and some goodies. And but in the meantime, we are going to go ahead and we're just going to end in this last song for any of those who want to stay. And if you don't, that's great too. So we're going to sing.